Kathi Weeks is an associate professor in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program at Duke University. Her book, Constituting Feminist Subjects, was reissued by Verso in 2018. It looks again at feminist standpoint theory and tries to remove some of the imaginary blockages that have stymied the development of a socialist feminism. And her important book, The Problem with Work, is a panoramic study of the ways that we tend to think about and value work as a foundation not only for our livelihoods but also our lives. In this conversation, we talk about the pragmatic value of utopian thinking, how it's become, in the years since The Problem with Work was published in 2011, notably less embarrassing to be utopian. Her goal is in many ways to engage with, as she puts it, the confining structures that police us in our homes and on the job, in our relationships to others, but it's also her hope that we will be more open to the ways that even seemingly small incremental changes can create the space necessary to pry open larger moments of revolutionary possibility. In The Problem with Work, you talk about creating a sort of feminist family. And I wondered if you could start by maybe elaborating on how you do the work of sort of distilling down from this huge archive of thinkers that you can select from a particular kind of line that lets you maybe avoid the standard traps of disciplinary ways of thinking. You know, Constituting Feminist Subjects talks about not wanting to be constrained by a particular genealogy of thinking. And similarly, you know, Sarah Ahmed writes in certain ways about like wanting to produce a feminist survival kit that includes both feminists and feminist books. How for you is creating that useful archive that Ahmed talks about necessary maybe for writing your specific brand of political theory?
Yeah, no, it's a very timely question for me because I'm just finishing up a chapter that's really looking at the term archive and trying to really think about it in the context of my own work, because I've long been interested in this question of how do you read and how do you approach inspirational texts from the past? Because that's always been my method. I have a thing about 1970s feminism, and it's always been my source of inspiration. And in fact, it's to the extent that I have a method, it's about going back to some of these older texts, because this is the period of the kind of the heyday of Marxist or socialist feminism, where you get some of the I still think the best work was done. And so I always go back to those old texts and I just find them really rich and interesting. And then I try to think about ways to like update them and kind of bring them into the present moment. And so, I've done that with feminist standpoint theory and for wages for housework, um, for 1970s feminist family abolitionism. And so, I've always been thinking about why, first of all, why are these texts so interesting to me? But more important, like how do I how do I bring them into the present? And how do I think about myself as part of this intellectual tradition? So, I mean, on the one hand, I'm always finding these older texts inspiring and generative, but I also don't want to be beholden to them, in any kind of personal or political or theoretical way. So I've been like trying to formulate different ways of imagining myself as part of this intellectual and political tradition that doesn't rely on like familial metaphors, like, lineage, inheritance, um, foremothers, or even, identification. So I don't want to rely on those kind of metaphors. And I don't even want to rely on the notion of a tradition, which seems to assume that there's some kind of like inherent order and temporal relationship among these texts. Because I think both of those, the family metaphors, but also the notion of tradition, makes me too beholden to them in some ways. And I want to pick and choose, and I want to sort of, remake them and not, I don't want to honor these texts in some ways. So I've been really thinking about, the notion of an archive as an alternative, because an archive is something that, it's something you construct. It's not just there. It's not a tradition. It doesn't, evolve over history. It's not familial. It's not kind of predetermined in that way. An archive is just something you put together. It's a more random, is the way I'm imagining it anyway, as a more kind of random collection of texts, but still there's a relationship among them. So when you read these texts as an archive and you read them kind of together, you find something new in each of them because they kind of echo or amplify different kinds of arguments or questions if you read them together, and they kind of build on them. So if you read these three texts together, you might find something different than when you read this text as part of another archive, together with other texts. So, like, I've been experimenting with this archive of three texts, one by Shulamith Firestone from 1971, from Donna Haraway from 1985, and then, one from the Xenofeminism Manifesto from 2016. And in some ways, they don't kind of belong together. But when you read them together, like, some things just kind of really jump out in a really forceful way. And so that's how I'm trying to think about where I put text together. Not so much that I can learn from them, but more ways that I can be inspired to think differently without, at the same time, like I said, not being indebted to them or beholden to them in the way like an ethnographer is sort of indebted and beholden to their subjects, or even a historian, I think, is indebted and beholden to the historical archive. And I do want to, like, read them seriously, but I don't want to be beholden to them. I want to mix and match. I want to change whatever doesn't work for me.
I think that is such a liberating kind of methodology. This, like, it's almost a methodology of irreverence, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And and there is certainly something to be said for just being for trying to subvert the traditional ways in which people create scholarship. I don't want to talk too much about Ahmed, but she talks about how the canon has become this kind of straightening device.
Mm,
It has, like, straightened us out. It's made certain people necessary reference points, and your work kind of does away with that. It's like Jacques Derrida in Spectres of Marx talking about the problems of inheritance, and taking apart some of Marx's sons, these people who just are
yeah,
obviously truly beholden to a sort of orthodox Marxism.
yeah.
But at the same time, you're not doing away with these terms. Like, you have this wonderful article about the manifesto as a genre of writing, and you talk about how we can recuperate it if we name the kind of manifesto that we sort of desire. And you talk about how the Communist Manifesto has this kind of like unflappable confidence to it, this kind of declarative nature that compresses all of time into this kind of moment. The Xenofeminist Manifesto, and also I think Feminism for the 99%.
Yeah.
In that text, they name this kind of wave of feminist militancy that's erupted globally, and clearly are kind of declaring this moment to be something that is instructive. And I guess on that point, like, it seems like your work aims primarily to be instructive to the kind of strategic politics of trying to move forward in spite of all of these challenges to democracy. Like, for example, one of your most recent articles, Anti/Post-Work Feminist Politics and a Case for Basic Income, formulates your points in terms of lessons. When you were developing your method as a thinker and writer, how did you kind of develop that particular model of trying to instruct the reader rather than sort of dazzle us with your theoretical esotericism, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for that, I was just trying to, like, acknowledge that, and that's the weird thing with going back to these historical texts is, like, I actually, I became interested in basic income from reading Wages for Housework for the 1970s, where they didn't really talk about, they talked about wages for housework, not basic income, although in some formulations it was really the same as a basic income.
Hmm.
But that's where I really, and I hate, using these words faithful or honor or anything like that, but I wanted to acknowledge that that's where I learned about it, and I kind of want to make that clear that I'm actually, drawing a lot on these texts, even if I'm completely, I mean, I think certain, like, one of the members of Wages for Housework Today, Silvia Federici, she doesn't support basic income.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's not like I'm being beholden to them, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm learning things. I'm tracing my own thinking about how I came from this, and I find that sort of a useful way to sort of teach somebody about where I am, is to trace the lineages of it.
Mhm.
Even if it's it involves a lot of leaps and jumps in between them. So.
Hmm. I had some questions about someone who is clearly indebted to your work, and there are many, many people who cite you as a thinker on work that is particularly like you give a lot of leverage to people who are struggling with these intractable problems. I recently spoke with Kara Daggett for this podcast, and she's a person who writes about energy in particular, and she's made this kind of impact recently with her work on petromasculinity, or this kind of productivist and patriarchal drive to preserve a fossil fuel society. And when she was charting her the history of fuel for her book, The Birth of Energy, she's noted that she was surprised to find herself reading an enormous amount of literature about this centrality of the work ethic as something that's just ideologically, immovable. That's this conceptual foundation, certainly, of oil capitalism. And she also cites you as the person that allowed her to really rethink the whole course of our apocalyptic addiction to oil. One of her arguments is that we can't just solve the problem by moving to renewable energies unless we try and scale back the acceleration of work, of productivity. And she actually asked me if I could ask you a question about how you think about energy. It's not something that really comes up in your work. How do you think the acceleration of basically global capitalism, especially the 19th century, may have influenced these ideologies of productivism, the work ethic? And do you see any openings for a utopian politics of post work in the current impending and really the current climate catastrophe? Where do we go from this moment? And is there something persuasive about trying to articulate a politics of post work in this moment?
Yeah, no, that's really exciting, to hear about her work. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, there's a really strong link between capitalism and its system of work, and with that a kind of ideology of productivism or the work ethic, and then ecological destruction and climate change. So there, I think it's a very clear link, and I think a lot of authors are trying to sort of talk about what needs to happen with the work system, and the hours that we work and the way that we work, if we want to really deal with these catastrophes. And so Juliet Shore has talked about some of those kinds of things too. I mean, I haven't really, thought about it very much, but except to think about, the importance of avoiding, as a solution or remedy, a kind of, ascetic values as an alternative, that kind of ascetic denial of production and consumption. Like, I just think that is kind of a trap. And I think because it's, the kind of that sort of asceticism. Well, we need to cut back. We need to stop. We need to, cut back on our pleasures, whether that be work or consumption. Like, that way of kind of thinking and mounting an argument is drawing on the same fuel, that ascetic ideal that gave rise to, productivism and consumerism, right? It's almost like it's tapping into that same kind of energy to make this argument. So, I mean, I guess the kinds of arguments that I'm really attracted to are like, something on the order of Bastani's full luxury communism, that is the way to go. Like, to try to think about rich, full lives that don't center around work or consumption,
Hmm.
but to think about that as a kind of wealth of pleasures rather than that a kind of ascetic denial. So, I mean, that's the only thing that I'm kind of allergic to in some of that literature. And again, it's become a lesser tendency now, thankfully, that kind of, asceticism that I think is tapping into some of the, again, it's the fuel of other ascetic ideals like productivism and even consumerism in some ways too.
Hmm. There's this book, again, that's put out by Verso called A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal.
Mm,
And I think that sort of more hopeful and seemingly indulgent language is in some ways more mobilizing than the
absolutely.
kind of left melancholy, to use a term that you use in your work, that we certainly see in a lot of what Imre Zeman calls eco-apocalypse discourses. And Daggett, clearly is taking up your anti-ascetic argument in her book, and admitting that a lot of especially in the conclusion of that book, that a lot of the eco-apocalypse discourses turn people off. That there's something that works against a politics of transition in insisting on engaging with our inevitable doom.
Yeah.
Like it's not something that really resonates with people.
Yeah, yeah, because fear is politically disempowering. I
Hmm.
mean, even Hobbes knew that, right? Because he wanted to disempower the masses in some ways, and fear is the way to do that. But it is really, it can be paralyzing. I just don't think it's a really useful kind of political affect for the kinds of, agendas I'm interested in.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that you argue is this idea that, and through Ernst Bloch, that hope is valuable. Hope is something that can be potentially a source of emancipatory politics. And I think hope for me comes from reading these kinds of texts. I mean, Anna Singh's "The Mushroom at the End of the World" similarly talks about how, and Alexis Shotwell's "Against Purity." All of these books are really about trying to make visible um, experiments with alternative ways of living, like imaginative possibilities. And so here I found your work on utopia so valuable. Like you have this idea that we need to kind of resuscitate utopian thinking, or like wrestle it away from those that think it's somehow intrinsically embarrassing to be utopian. Do you think that the kinds of solidarity we're seeing with, for example, Indigenous land protectors here in Canada, with the Wet'suwet'en peoples rising up to stop pipelines, that there's a way in which utopian thinking maybe is becoming more seen as, at least as more practical, more a way out of our current crisis-driven times?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I think, utopia is not nearly as embarrassing as it used to be when I started talking about it.
Mm,
So I don't know what to make of that, but I think you're exactly right that there is something that is allowing people to, be less reactively embracing of this claim to be a realist.
mhm.
That was so much of the part of the 80s and the 90s. So I think that there are some openings in these experiments. I mean, yes, I absolutely think utopian experiments are crucial as a kind of pedagogy, as examples. Maybe some of them even could be kind of scaled up for larger sort of projects. On the other hand, I am not going to be the person who's going to sort of talk about them in some ways. In part, it's because I tend to be more of a structuralist. And so, going even to the example of gender theory, some want to say that, well, the gender binary that tries to produce us into, a kind of complementary heterosexual genders is a system that's always been failing. And so, just look at the examples of people who are not traditionally gendered in that way, non binary, or the proliferation of genders that don't match their sex, that don't match up with a heterosexual sexuality. And just look at this as a way to recognize that these structures are not totalizing, they're already failing, and there's already possibilities in there, utopian possibilities. And on the one hand, I completely agree. It's just that in my own work, I tend to focus much more on the confining structures that nonetheless try to enforce, even as much as they fail, this sort of gender binary. And in terms of work, I mean, I guess I've spent a lot of time sort of um, raining on the parade of counterexamples, just because I'm sort of interested in, e- particularly when it comes to like examples of post-work practices, or when people want to answer that question, well, what would we do, and what would it look like if work was only a small part of our lives and it wasn't the center of our existence? And I find myself constantly playing the role of critiquing those examples, because I think in some ways, I think we need to linger much longer and more deeply with the ways that productivism and the work ethic has colonized our imagination of practice itself, so that when we imagine practice, like being active in the world, it often takes on the form of kind of productive activity. And so, like in some of these ideas about like communist utopia, what it would look like, sometimes they sound like, well, we're gonna do art, but we're gonna do it productively. Like it'll be serious, and we'll want to do it constantly, because we won't have these other kinds of. And that just sounds like, well, we're gonna do it as on the model of the way that we do work now. So I find myself being someone who kind of tries to take apart people's experimental examples of post work or non work, more than, even though I recognize certainly that there are examples and that we need to cultivate them, I usually have taken the other tack. Just because I do think that we just need to linger longer on how insidious this ideology of work um, is in our culture.
Yeah, I noticed that very much about your work is that there is a kind of restless oppositional quality that does away with easy answers. As you say, there's a rigorous willingness to critique these exemplary counterexamples.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
you advocate something more along the lines of these partial visions, and there's a way in which you're, yeah, certainly advocating lingering longer than simply, assuming that there are these available symbols of hope already in front of us. And on that point, I think one of the ways in which we see a model of utopia, cited today is by gesturing to, various forms of like technological fixes, machine learning as something that's going to crack particular health problems, maybe solve the problem of renewable energy being inconsistent, like whatever it may be. These technological singularities are often cited as though they will just magically fix an unjust society. Like for example, even though Uber doesn't actually make any money, they still are cited as though they are this like untouchable corporation because of the way in which they've really built saturation. They've kind of, they've saturated our thinking in a lot of ways and made themselves the dominant model. And I wanted to ask you, because it is kind of a timely story, about the successful propaganda campaign that was led by Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash to get Proposition 22 passed in California. This is a proposition that that almost didn't pass, that didn't have a lot of support, but there was this enormous investment, $200 million invested in saturating TV and digital ad space, bombarding gig workers themselves with in-app notifications suggesting that drivers want to remain independent contractors, and a yes vote would be good for them. And what's dangerous, it seems, is that executives have already said they're hoping to replicate that process across the country. Why was their pedagogy of productivism basically necessary to push that measure through? And what do you think the implications of that particular precedent are going to be?
Yeah, I have to say I was kind of surprised by that.
Hmm.
That it worked so well even in this moment.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't be so surprised. I mean, it's not just the kind of technophilia that capitalism has long kind of cultivated as this entrepreneurial myth, and about the productive forces and the way that capitalism unleashes them, more than other systems could. So I guess it's that, but it's also like I'm surprised that we still accept that jobs are good no matter the quality of the jobs. Like it's like jobs are an unqualified good, literally, because the qualities of the job don't seem to matter. When we talk about jobs programs, it's just like, well, what jobs
Mhm.
program? I mean, what would the jobs be like? It's like the astonishing success of the ideology, the capitalist ideology of work, and this kind of democratization of abstract labor. So, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It's like it's all about the paycheck. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with actually what happens when you go to work every day and what you are working towards, or even how much the paycheck is given what you're doing. It's just like any job is seen to be a gift to the entrepreneurial subject who's just dying to, kind of feed their entrepreneurialism, rather than what it really is this meager offering to desperate workers, and that's all it is. But I'm just kind of, I have to say, I was shocked that that succeeded as well as it did.
Yeah, it was surprising, and the idea that it can be scaled up, that model of that kind of
Yeah,
propaganda model is unnerving.
yeah,
But it seems like there is this, there's a book called Inhuman Power by Cosin, Steinhoff, and Dyer Whitterford that talks about the AI effect. That there's a way in which like AI as this again like this horizon of possibility is somehow seen as synonymous with a certain utopian future. But that book really pierces that illusion and says like we're ignoring the material conditions under which this technology is being developed. Like it's really a secretive thing. It's a monopolistic endeavor, and so the idea that automation will be somehow, as you say, a gift to the entrepreneurial subject, that
yeah,
people will just learn to program these machines and that will be their new jobs, is part of the like this nirvana of an automated future. Do you? I mean, this is kind of I think related to the question of like the gig economy or a society organized around the internet. Do you see automation as in any way utopian, or do you see that shift to a different kind of economy that's driven by automation about really the elimination of the necessity of human labor?
hmm. That's a good one. And I have to say, I guess I start with a confession is that I would, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess. So, I mean, I'm on the side of technology in that sense. And also like in terms of these classic utopian positions, there's two sort of major texts in the Marxist utopian tradition. Bellamy's Looking Backwards, where he imagines a life, a future where work is reduced and machines are doing all kinds of things for us, and then there's consumer abundance. And then the other one is William Morris's News from Nowhere, where it's a kind of like return to a craftsperson utopia of unalienated labor. And I guess, in some ways, so Bellamy's trying to like eliminate exploitation and have less work. And then uh, Morris is about, the end of alienation. And I'm definitely Team Bellamy on that one too. So on the one hand, I really do think that there is potential. I mean, it's not necessary, but I think there is potential in sort of technological developments and events. It's not really, so it comes up a lot in the politics of basic income, because some people say, well, we need a basic income because of looming technological unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
right? That technology is just eliminating work in some ways. And, I actually think in some ways that is true in some sectors. And then, the capitalist economists say, yes, but people have worried about that all the time. And it turns out that if there's technological unemployment in one sector of the economy, a new sector of the economy will develop and absorb all those laborers, so that it's not going to be any problem. Well, I think it will actually profoundly shape quite a few sectors of the economy. I don't think it's going to eliminate work because, as Benevev and others note, there's many service jobs that can't be, you know, done by robots or digitized. And as Peter Frace notes, some of these jobs are so low paid, there's no incentive to sink a lot of money into, process to automate them too. So, but what I said in my article on basic income is that, I actually think this is really not that important. I mean, I think it's like the tip of the iceberg in terms of the problems with the work economy. This prospect of, automation and technological unemployment, because the work system is such a mess in terms of being an insecure way to distribute income and an incomplete way to distribute income, because a lot of people are doing productive things that are not getting rewarded with wages. That technological unemployment, to the extent that it happens, is just almost a kind of a minor problem with the system, and there's larger kinds of problems with it. So in the end, I kind of avoid the question because I just don't think it's quite as pressing as the media would suggest, in terms of in relationship to other problems with the wage system and work.
That's so interesting that you say like there is a media fascination
Mhm.
with this looming technological future.
Yeah.
I like that you kind of provide a check on that and say like there are more pressing issues. I think the pandemic has started to make that visible. In April, the government launched the Emergency Response Benefit, or the CERB, and it was meant to mitigate the social effects, the economic effects of the pandemic in this country. And the United States is now facing a paltry relief package that the Republicans have fought tooth and nail to really make inadequate, right? And to ensure also that corporations will face no liability whatsoever. And in this country, similarly, I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that as the CERB kind of fades away, a lot of people in this country made more with the benefit than they did from their actual jobs. And beyond that, the federal government has also recently voted down a wealth tax, and the notion of a universal basic income, despite the fact that the Canadian public generally supports it. But what's interesting is that what they've done is instead promote this widespread system of subsidized childcare. I don't think it's like gone through yet, but there is this report that's been released by the Center for Future Work, which estimates that between something like 360,000 and 700,000 women between 25 and 50 years old could join the labor force over 10 years as part of this national child care program is developed. So there's like some recognition, however oblique, of the fact that women do the bulk of reproductive labor, or caring work. But I wonder like how you are decoding these seemingly incremental steps toward providing people with a basic income. Like the pandemic is making these moves necessary, but we're not seeing any sort of breakthrough. How do we make room for really utopian thinking in the COVID moment?
Oh, that's so interesting. Just because from a US standpoint, just the idea that Canada would offer some subsidized childcare feels completely utopian. That just
Mm.
would not happen here. Um, yeah, I mean, I think after the pandemic, I think it really is. I think that it's really been amazing how the work and family system has been, so many of its fault lines have been exposed in really kind of more than I would have imagined in some ways, because it's always seemed kind of obvious what the problems with the work system and the family system are, as the main systems we have for distributing income to people, right? You either have a job, you get paid, or you share it with other people in your family or support some members of them, like children. And it's always been a incomplete and precarious system, and I think it's just really been revealed in the ways that it just can't support people. And then also this question of like what's essential work, that is coming up, I think is fascinating, because most work is obviously inessential. And again, any way that we start asking questions about the qualities of jobs, I think is really important. I mean, I just think that's a way to arm people with critical tools in that way too. So, I mean, I do see a lot of opportunities in this moment, for making some of these steps. I mean, some of these steps in and of themselves might seem like losses because you only got this and not, a regular, income paid to people. And I think that's true in some ways, but I just think in politics you have to think about some of the steps and some of the concepts, right? So the concept of essential worker, for example, that the way that these concepts, that the way that they get spread are really enabling some critical thinking. And part of politics is about making these concepts and spreading them, so that people have them available to think critically about work. So, I mean, let's see. Part of the way that I think you have to think about political change is on a longer temporality, and we don't like doing that.
Mm.
I mean, we want to think about what we're going to get now. And I just think that if you're thinking about anti-capitalism, right, and anti-patriarchal capitalism, you have to start accepting the realities of longer temporalities, that we're talking about long-term change, and you have to think about how that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not willing to dismiss some of these, minor reforms as defeats,
Mm.
or not only defeats. I mean, I think some of them also generate some kind of new opportunities to advance different kinds of arguments, and enable people to think kind of more critically and maybe more imaginatively about their present situation.
Yeah, I agree. And this is again why I think your work is so instructive, right? Like, language matters. The steps and the concepts are kind of in lockstep with one another in a sense. For example, in your recent anti slash post work article, where you talk about the pursuit of basic income, you really insist on this idea of like trying to move past, in some sense, getting hung up on the dichotomy of reform or revolution. They're terms that you just say, I reject, and I think that's so refreshing in a way, because I get caught up a lot of times in my discussions with people on this question, whether incremental reforms are better than just like outright doing away with the structure as a whole, as though that's available to us. So I think this kind of almost pragmatism is interesting in your work because it's not sort of like an idle pragmatism, to use a maybe weird phrase. Like, it's about
Mhm.
trying to reckon with the facts, the fact that, as you say, the only way capitalism will likely be able to sustain itself is through basic income if you consider the kinds of crises that it faces. And then you acknowledge that basic income is not the final goal. It's about, as you kind of just articulated, opening up new ground. And so I guess, to kind of tease this out a little bit more, why do you think it's necessary to identify the short-sightedness, basically, of seeing battles over basic income as something that can be achieved through a single win? Like you mentioned, Andrew Yang as a potentially, as like one of these leaders in terms of like promoting basic income. Do you think there's something specific about Yang that makes him in particular problematic? I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit more basically on this.
Yeah, I mean, my problem with Yang is, well, both the income was set too low, and how much the income is, at what it's set at, and I'm talking about a minimal livable income, that maybe, particularly if you join up with some other people, you could actually survive without working for money, although probably most people will want to supplement it, by working for wages. Because if it's just a small amount, yeah, it's just going to subsidize low wage employers in the way that kind of food stamps in the US now subsidize Walmart and other low wage
Mm.
employers. So I mean, I think it matters, really in important ways, how much it's set at. And I think his was too low. So that's part of it. But I think more importantly is that that's not how we're going to get the kind of basic income we want, is through a leader who's going to kind of impose it from the top down. Because in order to get the kind of basic income that we need, which I think is a minimal livable income, it's going to require a lot of pushing from a coalition of kind of armed movements. Because, not armed literally, I meant, ready to, do kind of discursive battle.
Hmm.
Because I think, if we are going to get it, I just can't imagine a scenario where it won't first be instituted at a very low rate. And the way that we get it the way we want is to keep pushing, use that as an opening and keep pushing and pushing and lobbying for a minimal livable income. And that's just not going to happen from that kind of top down model. You get a candidate who's going to kind of usher it through. I think it has to have a lot of sort of, grassroots momentum and leverage behind it. So, I mean, my problem is not so much with Yang as with the idea that you could elect a candidate who's going to somehow, push this through, and that's going to be the political mechanism rather than coalitional social movement being the mechanism.
Yeah, and this is something that resonates with me certainly. Like the idea of trying to do away with politics as spectacle. Politics is really predicated on having a charismatic leader. Like that seems to me a really it's been shown to fail in a variety of ways, like, and this is something you talk about in relationship to Obama to some extent. The election of Barack Obama was seen as somehow spontaneously producing a kind of progressive future that no longer had to be fought for. And I think at least this time around, with the compromise that the Democratic Party made in going with Biden, there is, it seems like, a palpable sense on the left that, now that he's in office, the point is to push him. Like you talk about how, you know there are compromises perhaps that need to be made. These signifiers of hope are valuable to inspire what you term utopian longings, but you still need to evolve a politics beyond that, right?
Yeah, it amazes me every 4 years how many people get sort of not just that they take presidential politics seriously. It is serious. I mean, it's important to get Trump out of office. It is serious, but how much they end up sort of kind of this cult of personality develops even on the left in ways that I always find kind of mystifying. It's like, how did that happen? But I mean, it's important, but it's, this is an individual, inhabiting a very limited kind of office. What are you imagining is this, individual is going to do for you? So, yeah.
Mhm. And in your work, you really argue that we need to recognize the value in trying to develop new vocabularies for articulating how our time can be better spent. Um, and I find that really valuable. Compromise might be necessary in certain moments, but we do need to maintain that kind of utopian spirit, as it were. And I guess on that point, one thing that you note is about basic income is that it is this kind of coalitional thing that it does produce broad solidarity. It seems to be a persuasive demand, and you actually link it to reparations and the argument for reparations. That's a connection that I have not typically seen made. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit further on that point. Why are reparations and basic income linked from your perspective?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are a couple authors who link them. I mean, one way I think that it makes more sense, thinking about basic income as a way to at least address racial wealth and income gaps. And so reparations would be one way to think about that. And I think the people who are talking about it more often in ways that could be linked to a kind of reparations model are those who argue not for a regular remunerated basic income like a social wage, but as a kind of one-time stakeholder grant. And so that at a certain age, somebody will get a chunk of money, will be there, they're as a stakeholder in this economy, that you will get this. And that might be a way to think about slowly remedying a kind of racial wealth gap. I've not been that interested in that kind of model because I really want to think about basic income as a as a remedy for the failures of the wage system. So I really want it paid as a wage to really sort of highlight that that's what the problem is. And I suppose it could sort of alleviate certain amount of the, the racial income gap. But I think, you know, part of this is the arguments that are made to support it. And I think you could make a reparations kind of argument as a way to support it. I think it would work better as a link and support for the stakeholder grant than the basic income. But there are some authors who are doing that.
I'll have to have to do more research. I wonder if we should talk a little bit more about your work on gender in particular, the family, this notion of abolishing the family. You've written really forcefully on this subject. You're generally kind of antagonistic to normative ideas of what counts as a family, and I think there's a lot to be gained by advocating for that kind of antagonism. Like, for example, you write that, quote, heteropatriarchal family may function as a haven in a heartless world for some. For others, it's a sad and dangerous sight. And you cite the 2008 UN report on femicides as an indication that something is deeply wrong with the model of this kind of matrimonial codependency that neoliberalism really is founded upon in many ways. Here in Nova Scotia, we saw the largest mass shooting in Canadian history happen this year. A man with a history of domestic abuse and a penchant for the police went on a rampage after collecting grievances for years. And people have been trying to wrestle with this, this trauma. And there's now a public inquiry that's happening into the handling, really, of the case by the RCMP. But there's also a contingent of people who really think that it's important to look at this tragedy from a feminist perspective. And I wonder, like, from your perspective, how can rethinking the kind of constraints and the structures of the heteropatriarchal family lead us into a future of nonviolence? Would you say feminism is about this form of advocacy, like recognizing that traditional masculinity is a violent institution and that we need to move into a nonviolent future that recognizes that?
Yeah, I mean, the literature that I'm interested in now in thinking about family abolitionism, as they called it in the 1970s, focused, and so it's kind of the more Marxist, socialist, feminist literature that focused less on masculinities, although I think various toxic masculinities are central to all of this, but tried to think about the institution of the family as a kind of, I don't know, that violence is exacerbated in the kind of hothouse conditions of the small enclosed nuclear family unit, where it's so isolated, also in the sense of being under supported or unsupported as a site for all of the kind of reproductive and caring labor that happens in it. And this sort of gendered, the history of it's kind of as a patriarchal heterosexual unit. I mean, I think, you know, Barrett and McIntosh in their, very famous book Against the Family talked about, they call it the antisocial family, the nuclear, heterosexual family, because it kind of like, they say it sucks the juices out of any other kind of realm of sociality, because our social life is supposed to reduce to, kind of work sociality, and then the family as the center of our, sources of intimacy and contact and connection. And again, it's too heavy a weight on such a small and fragile unit. The site of, it's supposed to be our deepest intimacy, but also of labor, where the children are our personal property. I mean, all of this seems to me to be a recipe for violence. Um, and I think that the couple form at the center of it is also wildly overburdened, particularly when you start talking about this kind of complementary or uncomplimentary gendering of classic models of masculinity and classic models of femininity that are constructed to have very little in common, right? They're supposed to be complementary in that sense. So one can do the domestic work and one can work for wages, for example. But they seem to be very uncompatible in the way that they've been constructed, and then forced to live with this idea that the couple form will, that your partner will serve, is supposed to serve as your best friend, your sexual partner, your partner for raising children, your partner for caring for the elderly, your partner for social reproductive labor. It's just too much. I mean, it's a ridiculous kind of ideal, so it's not surprising that it just cracks under the weight of the disappointment and rage and anger that it produces. So I mean, I really do think that our models and ideologies of the family are implicated in some of the violence that happens there, and certainly the kind of privatization of the family that gets fetishized, and so you imagine it as this safety, this haven of safety, and so the fact that it's actually where most of the violence takes place becomes hidden both literally and figuratively from view.
And I think, there is still an enormous amount of sort of attachment to it. That's what's interesting. And you often express this puzzlement in your work, like, why isn't there more investigation into the kind of structural roots of our unhappiness? And decentering the family comes up in your work, even decentering the child. It's something that you insist upon, but you acknowledge that the family is, even though it's a deserving target of reform, as you put it, it's also very difficult because the family is still foundational. It's this, you call it a rhetorical temptation. So I think people should read your particular take, I think, on the family. It could really pry open this kind of space of critical reflection. Um,
Yeah, and again, it is difficult because we're so deeply, you know, our desires for family are so long,
mm,
have been cultivated for so long, and so they become so deep. And so, when I try to think about family abolitionism, I don't mean this as an ethical project, like you should live differently, you should want something different, like, because I just don't find that useful or even legitimate. But and this again is following Barrett and McIntosh on the antisocial family, is say, well, they want to transform not the family but the society that needs it.
hmm
And I think of that as a really important way to conceive the politics of family abolitionism. And so, and again, individuals need it because in some ways it's all we have besides work. But I think society needs it too, as a privatized system where social reproductive labor, the labor of taking care of ourselves so we can go back to work the next day, the labor of raising a new generation and taking care of the older generation, like like the family still serves as the way that most people are recruited into households where this labor gets done. And then the family also assigns the different labors to the different genders, and it naturalizes and privatizes all of that work that gets done there and recodes it as non-work, as labors of love or something else. And so, I mean, if individuals need the family, society really has been profiting off it in really tremendous ways. So I mean, I really think it's important to kind of expose that and to try to like I'm interested in trying to think of ways to provide the material conditions for people to move out of families or to make other kinds of choices, like, so a guaranteed basic income, shorter hours, the provision of other forms of housing that make living alone or a different kind of group configurations possible. Like, all of these are the material supports for people to kind of make other kinds of choices, and to kind of experiment with other kinds of household configurations. And so, family abolitionism is not directed towards individuals and their current desires. It's about trying to think about creating the material conditions that would allow other kinds of desires and relations of intimacy and care to flourish. So maybe that puts less burden on, you know, you know, attacking the attachments that people now have to their families.
Yeah, I think so. There's this way in which your work is about exposing a kind of unfreedom. like saying perhaps we need a form of, I think you use the term transvaluation. I think a lot of the time, in conversations among people on the left, there is this sense that like crisis is an opportunity to push things forward, like to push a particular discourse on, for example, abolishing the family, or trying to defund the police and reroute some of that money into the community. Like
Yeah.
in the United States, there is this kind of brewing crisis within so-called affective labor, or at least a sense that there's something about the gendering of immaterial affective social labor that makes it especially important in the context of COVID. For example, I was watching PBS NewsHour last night, and they were talking about the so-called she session, this recession that's particularly impacting women, as opposed to the so-called man session caused by the 2008 financial crisis, the like decline or disappearing of like, I guess, construction work and these kinds of traditionally masculine jobs. The story goes, at least, or the statistics suggest that something like a quarter of women in the US are considering leaving the workforce, that so-called people-intensive jobs are disappearing, and that those jobs are typically occupied by women in like retail, leisure and hospitality, and so on. And in the context of this report, there was something really striking. One of the women that they interviewed, talked about not feeling like she wasn't contributing to her family at all because she was doing all of the family care work, and not making any sort of wage.
Hmm.
Um, the crisis is bringing these social realities that had been invisibilized to the foreground, but it's a question, I guess, of whether we will seize the moment on some level, and reckon with the ways in which we can either, as you put it in your article, life within and against work, just reinscribe these rigid gender categories and say, like, that woman is failing her family by not doing both all of the care work and like making a wage, or as you say, kind of challenging that, challenging it, and in particular the gendered organization of labor. Do you see any value in this current crisis along these lines, or is it really just a question of emergency measures, the exigencies of capitalism, kind of demanding women do both?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that one example is super complicated because she's obviously doing the same kind of thing for low wages that she's doing for her family, and yet, even the low waged version of it seems like something rather than the labor that's not wage she's doing doesn't seem like anything. So it's particularly complicated there. And I think this, it should be said too that this she session is also because in this situation where, kids aren't going to school, is that, you need much more caring labor. And if women are making, if, in these woefully underpaid jobs, they're going to be the ones more likely to quit because they're not making enough to warrant, um, the sacrifice. I mean, I think that's part of that story of women leaving work. It's leaving very low waged work because there's no alternative for the caring that has to be done in those families. But I don't know. I mean, I think I've been hearing a lot more about how much work parenting is, because there's been this sort of like, again, this model of intensive parenting has become generalized. It used to be, just the model for the professional managerial classes to, create enough social and, communicative skills in their children so they can pass on their own class status to their children. And it was sort of that model. But now it's become, the general template of what good parenting is supposed to mean, which means most people, who are working long hours in addition to parenting are going to fail by all of these sorts of measures. And I think that finally during the pandemic, when on top of everything else, they had to help educate their children, it's finally become, something that people are talking about, is that this caring labor, and particularly child taking care of children, is an enormous amount of work, and that all of these employees are finding it difficult to do both. And it's the first time I've heard this, reported in the media, more than just, once or twice. So I think there is a kind of moment for recognizing both the unwaged labor that's being done. But more interestingly, and I think your example of that one person might be a way to kind of push this, is the is the arbitrariness of what kinds of practices we get paid for and that we don't get paid for. Right? Because maybe the content of her job is the same thing that the content of her work in the home. And it's sort of random that one earns a wage and the other doesn't. I mean, it's the same sort of socially necessary, kind of valued, skillful practice that's required for the reproduction of society, which is required for the productive system. And yet, I mean, I would like to find a way to talk about how random it is that she only gets paid for one of those jobs and not the other.
um, the puzzlement that you express so often, is about trying to kind of question the seeming absurdity of it. I noticed too, like recently, when I went to search something, Google has like a little link at the bottom that takes you to a video that they put together, underscoring the frequency with which this year people searched things with why at the front of their searches.
That's amazing.
Um, it's a little bit incredible, right? Like, and I wonder if in this context there is sort of more room for questioning that, the frequency with which people are searching why, why are people protesting is one of the examples that they give, suggests that there is a desire to understand why things are changing. You write, for example, that the question of whether this foot in the door incremental approach to political change is worth the risk is not only an important question, it's maybe the critical question. So like just that fact that people are searching with why might be, as you say, a wedge to help pry open things further. But you also suggest in that same turn of phrase that, you could break your foot
Yeah.
trying to get your foot in the door, right? So you can drive a wedge and then not necessarily kind of, push things successfully forward. And it's a question of, it seems like it is nonetheless still this question of language on some level, what alternative politics we can actually articulate in the present moment.
Yeah.
I think certainly the pandemic being this unprecedentedly global moment is at least helping us focus in particular on the question of what supports human survival, and it's this interdependence, as you say. It's like it's about what kinds of work we consider essential and making those things visible.
Right. And it's grocery store workers. I mean, who would have thought that before,
Yeah.
that that would be recognized? It turns out, the logistics of getting food to people is essential, and it's not something anyone ever really thought about it in the same way. So that is an example too of this kind of opening and this sort of possibility.
hmm Yeah, and the question of food is something I've talked about with Elaine Power on this podcast, and like food is a question of fighting for basic income, a question of human dignity, a question of not forcing people to make these impossible choices between whether to eat and whether to buy a birthday present for their kid. Like these are the kinds of questions we shouldn't force people to confront.
Mm.
And I think expanding the language of health in particular might be, a pretty profound way of like, this is something I've focused on a lot in my, kind of career as a teacher and a writer is how we can, move past so-called healthism or individual ways of thinking about health. You note in your collaborative article on precarity that the language of health has really been contaminated by biopolitical governance. And it seems to really only provide a really fraught basis for articulating a politics of like interdependence. Specifically, you write that, quote, health has become so tightly sutured to measures of productivity and complicit with workplace wellness programs as to be basically useless for our purposes. And I wonder if we could connect this to this kind of broader epidemic of anxiety, depression, even exhaustion, um, in the current COVID moment. I mean, there are all these reports that are pointing out the link between, for example, fatigue and workplace injury. And these come at the same time as we get books like, Ariana Huffington's The Sleep Revolution that detail how you can cultivate better sleep and be better workers and all this stuff. Can maybe politicizing our shared lack of rest be a potential site of solidarity?
Yeah.
You talk in The Problem with Work about like daydreaming as being something that's more interesting than dreaming because it tends toward world improvement, toward justice in some sense. but doesn't the capacity for daydreaming too rest on us getting enough rest?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a great book by Jonathan Crary, 24/7,
Hmm.
where he actually, so it's like capitalism is 24/7. We're always going, always going. And he wants to think about sleep as an act of resistance,
Hmm.
which is pretty smart, in some ways, that thinking about it is the only way that you ever get an exit or reprieve from it.
For sure. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time. You've been super generous with it. I really appreciate it. It was like a little intimidating putting together these questions for you. Your work is really staggering.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. And thanks for reading so much of my work. I was surprised that you cited some of those articles, and I'm honored. Thank you.
Well, I like to do my homework.
Yeah, no kidding.